Yes, thank you, Ed. It's really a pleasure meeting Ed. So we've known each other for 15 minutes now, 20 minutes. And I'm also very happy to be with Philip McCosker, who we've met a few years ago. So we've been in touch since then. So as Ed just told us, I think he's very courageous to have invited me. Not only because I'm a Frenchman who speaks with an American accent, which is probably the worst of all worlds put together, but also because, I'm discovering this field, really. But it's with a lot of, let's say, enthusiasm. And so I'll be giving something that I'm really expecting feedback because it's exploratory. The question is, the question that I want to confront and with you is that on the one hand, the Roman Catholic Church, and I'd say many churches, many Christian denominations, would consider themselves as people of God. This is very clear in the Roman Catholic Church. Even the Second Vatican Council, which has done great steps forward in Jewish-Christian relations, still says and even insists more than any other council beforehand that the Church is the people of God, the new people of God. It even says the new Israel, which echoes the Novus and Verus Israel of the times past. But on the other hand, the same Roman Catholic Church, for example, John Paul II in 1980, states that the Old Covenant has never been revoked by God. And there are other statements of this kind in church documents. The Old Covenant has never been revoked, but part of the Old Covenant, part of the promises to the people of Israel, are the fact that they are the people of God. I'm going to have probably a problem in English that's with, I never know if people are or is. You'll correct my English on that point. It's difficult. I don't know why people is supposed to be plural, but maybe there's a... Anyhow, so this is the question on the one hand. We have these two statements, these two kind of statements, which we also find in documents from other Christian denominations, where we have this tension between we are people of God and maybe the new people of God, and the Jewish people keeps their or its vocation and calling. So that will be the center of the talk today, trying to find out, well, in what way Israel is people of God and what does that mean, or are the people of God and what does that mean? Can we still say, that will be the second part of the talk, that the church is, and in what does that mean? Why does the church consider herself people of God, and in what way? And then if I have time, and if Ed doesn't stop me, what's at stake? Because it's not really, the real question is not a sort of a squabble or a quarrel between two brothers, but why does God need a people or want a people? What dimension of salvation is there here, and what does it really mean to be people, to be a people in God's design? So I'm going to take for granted that we all agree on the fact that in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, Israel is the chosen, beloved people of God. Chosen and created to be God's own precious heritage, and that there really is a distinction. It's not 100% clear, but it's mostly clear that on one hand, for Israel, you have a word with am in Hebrew, and which would be Laos in Greek, and on the other hand, you have a mostly plural goyim and ethnoi for all the other nations. So basically we have a structural distinction in the economy of salvation between one people and the nations. Now why is this? The reason is, of course, that God chooses a people to render a cult to God. That's the first reason, but also as a witness to God, a witness to the revelation. And this is where I think we were entering really into the theme, to welcome in a certain way the nations into the covenant. Now, there are different models. This is not always the case in the Tanakh. You have different possibilities. Sometimes the nations will be destroyed. The end of time is the destruction of the nations, but that's when the nations are against Israel. There's also the model, not very frequent, but the model where each nation stays in its place and worships the God of Israel, discovers and worships the God of Israel. I don't know how to say it. Malachi in English? Malachi. It would be in the book of Malachi, for example, the first chapter. What's much more frequent in Isaiah, Zechariah, is the nations come to Zion. The nations come to Zion to discover God, to discover the law. Maybe I can just have read just one reference, Isaiah 2, a very well-known text. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths." The question here is, when the nations stream toward Zion, do they enter into this people and become members of this people, or do they stay nations? And there we have two possibilities. Some texts we see the princes of the nations bowing in front of Israel. So that means that they probably stay outside. They learn from Israel, they discover the one God of Israel, but they stay outside of the covenant. But you also have moments in which, well, you have the eschatological banquet where everybody is gathered together, and there doesn't seem to be differences between the nations in Israel. And you have, for example, Zechariah 2:15, when time comes, many nations will join themselves to the Lord. They will be my people. The nations will be my people. And in same thing, Isaiah 19:25, Egypt will be my people. Assyria will be my people. So these are very powerful texts saying that in some way the peoplehood extends to others. Probably for me at least, this was the most illuminating text, the most powerful. Isaiah 66:21, that some Gentiles will actually become priests and Levites. So first, this is the first step. Yes, Israel is the true people of God, the Verus people of God. Israel is the true people of God. But the vocation of Israel is for the nations. At least we can say this. And I had the feeling, I don't know in how many of you are familiar with Roman Catholic theology of ministry, of priesthood. But it's an interesting thing is that in the Catholic Church, we're discovering more and more, especially the last documents, that ministerial priesthood is at the service, I'm going to use a theological analogy. Ministerial priesthood is at the service of baptismal priesthood, of common priesthood, which is not only are the priests, the ministers, at the service of the people, but at the service of their priesthood. They are there, the priests are set apart to remind everyone that everyone is called to be prophet, priest, and king. And the aim, the finality is not the priest, the finality are the baptized who are exercising true priesthood, the truest of the priesthoods. And I'd say this analogy, I think, works also, as every analogy to a certain point, with Israel and the nations. Israel is set apart, elected, priestly people, to remind all the nations that they too are elected, chosen and beloved by God, and are called to a certain extent to join in this priesthood. Okay, that would be the first step. The question now, so far I've been following the Tanakh. Now I'm going to shift to the New Testament and see what happens in the New Testament. I didn't say this at the beginning, but for obvious reasons of who I am and of time also, I'm really going to take a very specific perspective. I'm a Catholic theologian, and I'll be speaking from a very Catholic Christian point of view. I have to be clear about this. What happens in the New Testament? In the New Testament, of the different models of relation of the nations to Zion, there is a choice that is made, the third model, which is full integration. Full integration. The question will be, so I'll try to explain what this means, or at least where the texts are, but then what will the role of Israel be? Because there still is a specific role of Israel in that case. Just a few important New Testament texts. For example, Ephesians 3:6. That would be probably one of the main texts. The mystery of God's design entrusted to Paul is that, I'm quoting, through the gospel, the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel, members together of one body, and sharers together. Heirs together, members together, and sharers of the promise together. In Jesus Christ, but they're sharers of the promise given to Israel. They are no longer, this is Ephesians 2:19, they're no longer foreigners, nor immigrants. And immigrants is an interesting word, the parokoi, because immigrants were people who lived in the country with special rights, but they were not exactly the same rights as the citizens. And here what Paul is saying is, you Gentiles, he's speaking to Gentiles in the letter to the Ephesians, you Gentiles are co-members, and you are not only immigrants, you are really members, you are full members. And you can see this without going through all the texts. Another pretty powerful one is in the first letter of Peter, chapter 2, verses 9 to 10, where Peter uses the text of Exodus and Isaiah, in which God promises peoplehood, royal priesthood and peoplehood to Israel. And the letter of Peter applies this to the Gentiles. You are a chosen people. You were not a people, and now you have become a royal priesthood. You're probably familiar with these texts. Now, the question is, this can be debated. I mean, this is open to questioning, but I think it's pretty clear that there is a full membership. The question is, what happens to Israel? What happens to Israel? And this is something I've not found very often elsewhere, but it's very clear for me after studying for this conference, that the distinction stays, and stays very clearly. The nations join, they become full members, but the people, the original people of Israel, keeps its special status. I'll just take three confirmations. The first is the letter to the Ephesians that I've just quoted. I don't know if you've noticed, co-members, what was the first term? Co-heirs, co-members, co-sharers. In Greek, it's always sun. Sun means can mean a full membership, but it makes a distinction. You are a member, but you're co-member. Not exactly like the original nucleus. And there's the same idea in the very well-known image in the letter to the Romans, chapter 11, of the wild olive tree on which it's the good domestic olive tree, the holy root on which the wild tree of the Gentiles is grafted. A graft is really part of the tree, but a graft produces another kind of fruit than the original tree. So the difference is maintained. And the last text, which is an eschatological one, just in case we say, okay, this is a temporary situation, but Book of Revelations, chapter 7, you may have this present in your mind. You have the throne of God, the throne of the Lamb, and in front, usually in a Christian assembly, we would immediately think, yes, all the multitude of nations are gathered in front of there. But actually, that's a simplification. What happens is we have two bodies. Firstly, we have the 144,000 and I'm quoting, sealed out of every tribe of the people of Israel. That's Israel, in a specific, distinct position. And then we have the great multitude that no one can count from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages. So even in the eschaton, there is this distinction. Now, theological question, why? If you allow all the members, everybody to be a member, why do you keep a distinction? And once again, this may be a bit too easy, but I think it works. Theological analogy with ministerial priesthood. Ministers are ministers inside of the church. And they stay inside of the church, inside of the same body. And it's because the people that are the baptized need this presence of those who are elect to remind them until the end of their lives of their own priesthood. Is this clear? So we have this situation in which, of course, the aim is to allow for all those who are baptized to exercise their priesthood, their royal priesthood, but we still need the distinction. I don't know what happens in heaven to priests. That's a good question, is it? But the question is, at least during the whole of a lifetime, we always need these people who are set apart to remind. And same thing, inside the renewed body, the renewed people of God, we still need Israel to keep its distinction, to keep on reminding all the others that if they are members, it's only by election. Or it's fully by election, which is a more beautiful way of saying the same thing, because election is one of the most beautiful things there is, but it's a free and gratuitous reality from God's side. And we actually have a model of this in the Jewish people itself, or themselves, because themselves, okay, thanks. In the Jewish people themselves, it's the tribe of Levi, the tribe of Levi. Inside the 12 tribes, there's one tribe that is set apart to remind the others of the fact that all are a royal priesthood. So we have it's kind of God's logic of setting apart to make everyone participate. I'd say distinction at the service of the whole. So the question is now, what can we say about the church? Because so far, I have not spoken about the church. Well, you've probably noticed I've only spoken about Israel and the nations. And in the Bible, and when I say Bible, in this case, I'm speaking both of the Tanakh and of the New Testament, there is not the distinction between Israel and the church. We have a situation in which, even in the New Testament, we have Jewish believers in Jesus, Jews who do not believe in Jesus. I should actually have started there. Jews who do not believe in Jesus, Jewish believers in Jesus, and Gentiles who are little by little coming to join the little group of Jewish believers. But we don't have a distinct reality called the church. The word church appears, but it means ecclesia, it means assembly. It does not mean an institution. This happens little by little. Okay, people are discussing this point. I don't know what my esteemed colleagues think, whether it was the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century, but the parting of the ways between what became Judaism and Christianity definitely took time. There was at least a period of a few generations in which it had not clearly happened. But we are in this situation now. So what can we say about what we now call the church? And in front of the church, in front of her, Judaism or Israel. Some theologians would very simply say the church is not people of God. The church is not. R. Kendall Solon, who is he Episcopalian? He's Methodist. Okay, so Kendall Solon, for example, says, you are a member of the people of Israel through birth. That's really peoplehood. You are a member of the church through choice, through faith, through baptism. That's a community. It's not a people. And you should not call the church people of God, because it's a community of God. And there's a French Jesuit called Marc Rastoin, who was a colleague of mine, and who, studying Benedict XVI's works, says it's interesting to see how the further you go, you follow Pope Benedict's thought, the less he uses the name people for the church. He reserves it for Israel. And the more he uses family of God. The church would be the family of course, if we consider baptism to be that through which we become brothers and sisters through the one Son of God, then we are a family. We're brothers and sisters. We're not citizens or related by peoplehood. And so Marc Rastois also suggests let's not call the church people. Okay, so this will be on all YouTube stations, but when I started working on this conference, I agreed with them. I don't anymore. I don't anymore because, of course, this is because I'm Catholic and I have to consider the Second Vatican Council as doctrinal. And in the Second Vatican Council, the church is called people of God too often for a Catholic theologian to say, it just en passant. Because sometimes that happens in a council. You can really say, it's not the intention of the council. You know, you use this sentence because everybody was using it at that time, but it's not the intention of the council. But reading the Second Vatican Council, it's very clear. We can discuss this if you want to, but that it's intentional. The council is really defining the church as people and as new people of God. So what do we do with that? What can we do with this? Now, to answer this question, I think there are 2 or 3 things we have to do. The first is ask the question in a different way. Not, is the church people of God, but how is the church people of God, if she is? How can she be? And the answer to that question will be through her relation to Israel, but I'll have to specify this. The second thing will, what does new and true mean? When you say the church, for example, is the true Israel or the new Israel, what does new and true mean, theologically speaking? And the third, this is a methodological step. I hope I'll be able to be clear on this. I think we have to understand that we're not, we have 2 pairs of concept. One pair is the pair that we have in the Tanakh and the New Testament, which is Israel and the nations. The other pair is the newer version, which is Judaism and Christianity. And those do not really overlap. And I'm sorry, probably many of you know what I'm going to know this, but I think I have to go through a few steps of explanation and to understand how these 2 pairs link together, or how they, in French I would say, how they articulate to one another, how they correspond to one another, And I'm going to allow myself to, this is a bit of a simplification. It's an analogy, of course, but it'll be, I'll use the Pauline olive tree, okay? So this is the situation in Tanakh, where we have Israel and we have the nations that are coming to Israel. Normally, if I continue, this is the Pauline version. So we have the nations, we have the Holy Root, the people of the covenant, which becomes the old covenant at some point, with the patriarchs and so on and so on. And then comes, for Christians, the Messiah. I'm really sorry because I'm used to working in Italian and I just realized that Messiah in English has an H. You'll correct that. But it's still Messiah. And what happens at this point? There are 3 situations, not 2. There's not Israel and the nations, nor the church and the synagogue, to take the old way of saying it. But we have 3 situations. We have the graft, which are the nations grafted onto the people through their belief in Jesus. I mean, as I said, this is really a Christian explanation. We have, on the other side, the broken natural branches, which are Jews who do not welcome Jesus as the Messiah, who do not receive Jesus as the Messiah. A very interesting thing is the branches are broken, but the Greek is very clear, they're not cut off. Usually translations say cut off, but the word is to break without being severed. While Paul, 3 verses down, says, but you who are grafted, if you are unfaithful, you will be cut off. It's not the same word. So there's something about the natural branches, they cannot lose their role, their status. And then you have those, the part of Israel who are natural branches, but who receive Jesus as the Messiah. And they flourish in that way. And this is a reality that we cannot see with our eyes in the present day church, but that was the central nucleus of the new Christian community at the beginning. The apostles, Mary, the first disciples were all Jewish. This is the Jewish, the Judeo-Christians, let's say. They were all Jewish. So we have these three realities, and as well, if I go back, here, what do we have? Israel, in Paul's view, are those two branches. Not only the broken, or not only neither the one that has received Jesus. That's Israel. And these are the nations. And what has this become? Empirically, in history, it's become, oops, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Judaism and Christianity, which is not the same separation. I hope it's pretty simple in a certain way, but my point is this. We are not speaking about the same pairs. We have Israel and the nations, but we also have Judaism, which is only that part of the natural tree, and Christianity, which is both Jewish Christian and the graft. Now, who is the true Israel? Well, definitely the original natural tree is the true Israel. I know this is not the way true Israel has been used in the history of Christian thought, but looking at the way magisterium, at least Catholic teaching, but I would say even in other, I can quote other documents even from different denominations, we are moving towards a situation in which I think we can recognize that the true Israel is the natural tree. And what is the novus? What is the new Israel? Okay, bit more sensitive. This would be the Jewish Christian part. This would be the natural branch that has, why? Because new, this is very important, new does not mean other. In the Bible, mostly, new means renewed. I will give you a new heart. It's not another heart, it's a new heart. It's a renewed heart. I will make a new covenant. I'm really ready to fight on this. New covenant does not mean other covenant. It means renewed covenant. And for a Christian, the example is the resuscitated, the risen Christ. He has a new body, yes, but it's the same. If it's not the same, then the whole of Christian doctrine collapses. So in this case, we say new Israel, not new because it's another people that's taking the place. No, because it's the Israel that has been renewed by welcoming the Messiah, once again from a Christian point of view, and by opening up to the nations. That's the novelty. And all these, and the graft, of course, the graft is receiving its substance from the Holy Root. It's receiving its substance from Israel. So the question is, what do we say? Is the graft the Verus and Novus Israel? Okay, I would say no, not the graft, but the graft is really grafted onto the Novus and Verus, which means that if you continue, I actually skipped a part of the, if you continue, you come up with a situation, this is the final situation, in which you have 2 points of view. Can I move, yeah, I mean, even with the question is people of God, then you have people of God by birth, which includes present-day Judaism and this very tiny, wounded, swallowed-up reality of Jewish Christianity. And you have people of God by adoption, which is the graft. But if you ask Judaism and Christianity, well, this Judaism is here, and Christianity is here. And to answer the question, what is Verus and Novus Israel? Well, I would say, yes, the church, this is the church, because it's composed of the Ecclesia ex circumcisione, which is the Jewish Christians, and the Ecclesia ex gentibus, the church can call herself people of God because in the church there is really a part of the true Israel and the new Israel. And so the church as a whole, this part is not the true and new. This part is, and the whole can be called true and new because it has in herself a bit that is really the true and new. Is that clear? We don't have to agree. I just wanted at least to be clear so far. And this is the point in my 10 days ago I didn't think this. And I'm ready to say if we discuss and we have better ideas. But that's how I'm trying to piece together these different things. And just one last step would be, actually there's even a third part, which is all nations, all mankind is called to be people of God. In God's design, it's not only Judaism and Christianity that are concerned. And so we could put, in this case, we have people of God by birth, people of God by adoption, and people of God by calling, in God's mind, in God's design. But this is the part I skipped, but I'm probably coming pretty close to the end. But the part I skipped is to say, all three of these realities, if I go back, all three of these realities, which is Judaism, the Ecclesia ex circumcisione, and the Ecclesia ex gentibus, all three of these realities are really, in a certain way, people of God. Some by birth, others by birth and renewed, and others by adoption. But all three are wounded. All three are wounded in their peoplehood. From a Christian point of view, the Judaism is wounded for not recognizing the Messiah, and anyhow, Judaism is wounded by being split. The people is cut in two, are cut in two. The Ecclesia ex circumcisione is wounded because, for the same reason, she is cut in two in her peoplehood, and she is being completely swallowed up by the Gentile church. And the Gentile church is also wounded because the people she is grafted on is wounded. And also because she is part of the wound herself because of the persecutions and so on. So to conclude on that part, and I hope that I will be able to say just a few words on the third, yeah? Okay. I would just conclude saying, basically we have a people of God by birth, that is Israel, with the two dimension of Israel. We have a people of God by adoption, that is the Gentile church. And we have people of God by calling, which is the whole of humanity, trying to fit all that together. The question, and this actually in a certain way is practically more important, but I think we had to go through this, is why? Why does God do this? Why is it part of God's design to call the people and to not only lead the nations to discover the God of Israel, but actually to lead the nations to become a people with the people of Israel, keeping the sun, the difference. And very quickly, I'm just going to throw out a few leads for discussion. Why, I think, is a question of how full is salvation? Because the real question is, from a Christian point of view, we could say, all we need to be saved is to know Jesus Christ, to be forgiven our sins, to enter into new life. But no, we need much more. We need peoplehood. Why? Because peoplehood touches all our relations, and it goes even further. It touches our family, it touches the history of our peoples, it touches the question of land, it touches the question of language, it touches economy and politics. All that is part of what has to be touched by salvation. Full salvation means reconciliation, not only with God and with others, but with all these dimensions of humanity. Once again, the history of our people, our relation to our land, salvation that touches our way of doing economy, our way of doing politics, and so on, and so on, and so on. And so that means that eschatologically speaking, I believe that full salvation is to become a full people, not only a community, not only the community of God, but really the people of God with all these dimensions. But this is very dangerous. I mean, this is what leads to not having any separation between state and religion. In apartheid, South Africa, they used the text from Deuteronomy, for example, to support apartheid, because you have unelected people, the others are supposed to be kicked out or at least suppressed and so on. And we have there are, historically speaking, there really are texts where Deuteronomy is quoted by the regime to support their claims. And this is where the second dimension comes in, is yes, peoplehood, but peoplehood becomes purified and converted. The calling of God is to extend salvation all the way to everything that makes us a human in a people, but at the same time, it's not a people like we imagine a people to be, or rather, God transforms peoplehood. One of just to give two examples, the first thing is the identity of a people is usually considered to be something we find out by looking at ourselves. This is our identity. We're working on who we are, and we just look at ourselves and build our... And interestingly, the people of God, as a definition, is a people called for others, for God and for others. Real peoplehood, real identity is not for me and by myself, but for God and for others. It's a sort of a structure. In German, you would put the whole word together. In English, you have to put hyphens. People for the others. And the other thing is, I don't know if it's 100% true, but se non è vero è ben trovato, as they say. If it's not true, it's a very interesting idea. It's a French Dominican called Jean-Miguel Garrigue who has this idea. He says, of course, ethnically speaking, the people of Israel has a certain ethnic identity. There's a common root. Okay, that'll be... It has a common root, and they are sons and daughters of Abraham, and so on and so on. But at the same time, very interestingly, especially in Isaiah, this would be really in Isaiah, God does not choose a pre-existing people. God does not look at the nations and say, I'm going to choose one. God creates this people from the other nations. For example, in Ezekiel 16, you have this Israel speaking about itself, saying, God is speaking to Israel, your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite, which means Jews are not Jews, ethnically speaking, in the sense that they come from other nations. And why? This is very important because ethnicity is a great gift, a treasure, and at the same time, it's the beginning of every war. And God creates, after Babel, God creates a people out of different ethnicities to show that peoplehood goes over the borders, the frontiers and the borderlines of ethnicity, and that it's stronger than ethnicity. And ethnicity should not be a cause of division, but it's in a certain way a first melting pot people, created for that. And I could continue. I could take every one of the themes I said, relation to the land, relation to the language, In each of these cases, Israel is a very different type of people, and the main temptation throughout the whole of the Tanakh is to be a people like the others. And I think it's still a temptation now for the present day Israel. The question is to be a people like the others, while to be the people of God means to really be a people, but not like the others. So that would be what's at stake. Not only, of course, we have to recognize as Christians that the true people of God are Israel. Yes, that's the first step. But why? Why is this part of God's design? Okay, thank you. Oops, I have to.
Working? Yeah. Great. Well, it's a daunting pleasure to speak alongside Etienne and Ed. Both are friends, but esteemed colleagues who know much more about this area than I do. But I'm going to try and throw some ideas out there. Listen much more to what they've got to say. It's also very daunting because Etienne's paper is so rich and tight, and the argument, I think, works really well, and I resonate very much with it, especially from my Christian Roman Catholic point of view. Like Etienne, I'm wholly in agreement with the thrust of Catholic theology in the last few decades, which, as he has pointed out, developed out of the tentative openings at Vatican II, but then especially in the pontificate of John Paul II, to this new articulation of the relationship between the Church and Judaism, the surprisingly novel insistence by John Paul II on the ongoing covenant between the Jews and God, alongside, within, containing, shaping the renewed expression of the covenant in Jesus Christ. And it's worth reminding ourselves again just how surprising that move was after centuries and centuries of noxious supersessionisms, or theologies of replacement, as we call them now, especially, but not only, in our tradition of Catholicism. Etienne's elegant proposal that we should think of Jews and Christians as one people of God, but with variegated modes of membership by nature and by grace, though the word grace wasn't stressed so much in but I'll say a bit about it, is neat. And for Christians, at least, Christologically resonant. His insistence on the composite or hybrid nature of significantly both Jews and Christians is surely correct, and perhaps particularly timely, in a time when we're bombarded on all sides by ever more insistent calls for starker purities of various kinds, mutual exclusions between one group and another. So zero-sum games seem to be multiplying all around us in all different kinds of domains, not just religious. So it's good at this time, especially perhaps for people of faith, to be reminded just how mixed or hybrid we actually are, not just in practice, but constitutionally, and that seems to be part of God's providential plan for humanity. I liked very much, too, Etienne's point that as a people, both Jews and Christians are looking both inwards and outwards. That is, that their identities are constituted, we might say, in a stereovisual way. We're looking in two directions at the same time. It's part of our constitution as people of God to look outwards and beyond ourselves, to be ever more inclusive, to use that overused term, or, as Etienne just put it, a vocation to others. Our identity is exocentric, directed to those outside of ourselves, or perhaps allocentric, towards those other than ourselves. And again, this is a timely point which merits much development and needs actually to be deployed on the ground, because it hardly characterizes many of our communities today. And yet, even though I resonate with Etienne's paper so much, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't try to find some questions or issues which we can then talk about. And so first, probably a pedantic and perhaps trivial issue, which Etienne touched on right at the beginning, and I think actually this may actually be a question for Ed, in fact, in terms of the origins of the title. So our title is, Who Are the People of God? A neat elision of singular and plural. And so Etienne's solution to the problem Ed set is to suggest we are collectively a composite people, retaining and even mutually enhancing our differentiated identities, while forming, perhaps only eschatologically, a unity in God. But does that take our, that is, Jewish and Christian, differences seriously enough? Or, from another perspective, does it take our plurality of peoples sufficiently seriously? There is a universalist thread through Etienne's paper, which is mostly pianissimo, but kind of reaches a crescendo towards the end. So the question is, how great is the plurality of the people of God? If it indeed encompasses all of creation, which I think we would all agree on, human and non-human, how are non-Jews, non-Christians, and indeed non-humans to be grafted into that one people? How does that calling, your third grafting in, work? Is it only an eschatological matter, or should we be doing something about that now? If, for instance, we think that our question should really be a three-way conversation between the Abrahamic faiths and thus include Islam, then perhaps a more promising route, maybe, would be to generate a model related to our understandings of creation and creatures' relations to God. In this view, all of creation is a people of God. This might make Etienne's soteriological focus towards the end of his paper more tricky, but not impossible, I don't think. But it might set the table in a way in which more groups could take part. Secondly, a related question is, which Judaism and which Christianity are we talking about? Our internal diversity is so great that it would be helpful to know which variants of the two faiths would adhere to the model as Etienne has outlined it. It's clear on the Christian side that he's talking about Catholicism, but even in the case of that group, there is a very great diversity, not all of whom are au fait with the significant developments in Christian-Jewish relations in Nostra Aetate, let alone their subsequent, even more significant developments. Etienne's proposal is commendably scripturally focused, but many Catholics today, still today, are not a people animated by Scripture, despite the inroads of Vatican II. And I suspect the same might be said of some Jewish groups too, as Peter Oakes, for instance, has discussed. Thirdly, I have a lingering sense that Etienne's proposal, naturally enough, is fundamentally shaped by the categories of Christian theology. The distinction and relation between nature and grace, which is more in evidence in the written paper than his spoken comments, but that structures what he's saying, the distinction between the variegated modes of access, by birth, by grace, by calling. But that distinction between nature and grace is one which is very central to Christian theology, especially for instance, that of Thomas Aquinas, where grace is said to perfect but not destroy or replace nature. It rather enhances it without trumping it. But what I'm not sure about is whether that kind of distinction works so well in Jewish thinking. I mean, obviously, grace relates to chesed, but whether nature and grace work as a pair, which is transposable in a way which is... So it strikes me that in that respect, perhaps, and also perhaps in the soteriological focus, because the soteriological focus is necessarily and understandably from a Christian Catholic perspective, but whether those two theological elements can work sufficiently well from the Jewish side. But so hopefully you can say, I hope so. But the most fundamental question I want to raise relates to difference and opposition, a question which kind of underlies everything else I've said. I just wonder whether Etienne's proposal could be amplified by some discussion of different differences. We want, or may want, to be one people of God while retaining our differences. The question is, what kind of differences? So it seems we need a taxonomy of different kinds of difference. And fortunately, none of my students are here, but they would tell you that I'm obsessed by this kind of issue. So apologies for a hobby horse, but I think it's relevant. Etienne is clear that Judaism and Christianity are, quote, not in opposition. But I'm not sure that's quite precise enough. I suspect what you mean, Etienne, is that Judaism and Christianity are not mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. They're not binaries. They're not related in a zero-sum game. And that would be, obviously, the logic of supersessionism. And I would, of course, agree. But I don't think that that means that Judaism and Christianity are not opposed or different in any senses of those terms. I wonder we could perhaps look to Aristotle's classification of different kinds of difference and opposition for some help, though he's talking in a very different context, of course, but he gets a discussion of different kinds of difference going. He distinguishes between contradiction, which is that mutually exclusive kind of opposition, binary, the kind that Etienne and I, and no doubt Ed, would want to absolutely avoid, from other kinds of opposition, like contraries with intermediaries, where you have a scale between opposites, like black, grey, and white, and another kind of opposition, relative opposition, where the two opposites define each other, implicate each other, and Aristotle's example is parent and offspring. That seems perhaps more appropriate, though, as we were discussing earlier, the language of familial relations as applied to Christian-Jewish relations has a tricky history, whether it's parent and offspring or elder brother, younger brother. So there's more to think about there. But we need to think more about that, what kind of difference is going on there, because we're clear we want to assert the oneness of the people of God, but also the distinction and difference. And the question is how those go together. So finally, I want to end on an apophatic note. That's to say, a negative theology kind of perspective. So our question once again is, who are the people of God? And it's my view that if we take the final word in that question seriously, and here I think the Jewish tradition probably has a better track record than much of the Catholic tradition, we need to admit that when it comes to God, we do not in any ultimate sense know what we are talking about. This has been underlined time and again by the great exponents of apophatic theology, both Jewish, like Maimonides, and Christian, like Pseudo-Dionysius and Thomas Aquinas. If we take this point seriously, it should encourage a certain reticence in over-clarifying the relationships between us now. But it should also encourage us to see that the transcendent God whom we all worship is so transcendent precisely as to be immanent and immanent to all creaturely realities. That is, God the Creator cannot be excluded from anything which God has created. As Dionysius puts it, God is the negation of negation, or the overcoming of all creaturely exclusions. This in turn means, as Etienne stressed, that our understanding of people and peoplehood in this particular context, related to this unknown God, is significantly different to any supposedly purely secular idea of peoplehood. We are a people defined by a God whom we significantly, in many ways, do not know. So any judgments which we make at this side of the beatific vision are necessarily penultimate and provisional. But this should give us pause, but also hope. Thanks.
It's always difficult to be the last speaker, but being the only Jewish voice, you've allowed me room to be myself. And thinking about the categories that you've both identified, one of the questions I was asking myself when I read your paper and listened to you was, do I recognize myself in what you're saying? And I recognize part of myself. And it's when you look at that mirror, do I see myself or do I see somebody else? And one of the most difficult challenges in the interfaith encounter is whether I, as a Jew, can create an image that you recognize yourself as a Christian, and of course, vice versa. And it reminds me of the story of, do you know the story of, you're walking along a river and you want to get to the other side and you see somebody on the other side and you shout out to him, how do I get to the other side? And he looks back at you and shrugs and says, you are on the other side. And I felt that a little bit just listening to you, that perception of which side am I actually on and which side are you actually on. So I'd like to reflect on a few Jewish perspectives of this question of the people of Israel, and then perhaps respond to the categories that you've identified at the end. So the first thing that I think, there are three aspects. The first is this election, this beautiful election, that is this free election that God has undertaken with the people of Israel. that Jews regard themselves to be in an elect position, not through any of our actions, but simply through the choice of God. So there are numerous passages, but you are the sons of the Lord your God. This is from Deuteronomy. You're a holy people to the Lord our God, and the Lord has chosen you, bachat, but the root is bachar, that choice, out of all peoples on earth to be a people for his own possession. And the word there is segula, that term possession. That is something that's special. And that's a term that's used regularly in the Tanakh. And I think it was a quote that you offered, Etienne, from Isaiah. You know, my people, Egypt, Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my segula, my possession. So the point is, although all peoples belong to the Lord from a Jewish perspective, Israel is God's special possession. And I think that is going to lead us into this question of the different categories of that relationship. So the first thing is that there is this election, this free election. The second is this point of, as a result of which Israel are a holy people. And of course, as you know, the term for holy and holiness is kadosh, which is this sense of separation, the sense of being different, being part of and at the same time distinct. So, okay, the first thing is about election of the people. But the second is a very tricky one. You mentioned it, and we can't help but mention it, and particularly today on the 70th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel, is this question of land and all the difficulties that results in, with all the strife in that part of the world and the suffering of peoples, and at this moment particularly Palestinians in Gaza. But nevertheless, we would be foolish to avoid that part of being the people of Israel is this land of Israel and the concept of Eretz Yisrael and what that means. And it's part of that election. And I think we would be foolish to avoid that tricky issue, as theologians sometimes do. And there are numerous promises, numerous references to this connection between the land of Israel and the people of Israel and in God's election of that people. And I think it's particularly difficult for Christians, actually, because the concept of land is not something that's central. You may talk about the heavenly Jerusalem, but you don't necessarily get the earthly Jerusalem. So the third, election, land, and the third is the question of mission. And what it sometimes confuses my Christian students when I say that we Jews have a mission too. Christians are so often arguing about what the Christian mission is. They forget others might have a mission as well. So one of the aspects of the Jewish understanding of mission is, of course, or legoyim, to be a light to the nations. And what that means from a Jewish perspective, from a religious perspective, is being faithful to Torah. Now, how we understand Torah is a point of much dispute, but the concept of Torah is one of, from the root yara, to teach. So it is being faithful to the teaching of the Torah to Moshe, the teaching of Moses, and how we interpret that today. So therefore, there are three aspects from a Jewish point of view of being a people of Israel: election, land, and the mission, which is associated with Torah itself. Now, one of the historical challenges that Jews and Christians have faced is what happens when we fail in our obligations. We fail to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. It's seen as potentially a rupture from that relationship of being the people of Israel. That's what the church historically, in the Adversus Judaeus tradition, has done for many, many hundreds of years, which has been overturned, or I think it's fair to say overturned, in the 20th century, and particularly since the Second Vatican Council. But there's a Jewish recognition of Jewish failure, you know, and it's not a denial of that failure, but there is a sense that that relationship with the Almighty is so strong that even in response to Jewish failings, the covenant remains, the peoplehood remains, that we still remain the people of Israel. And that's biblical, that's medieval, and that's contemporary. So in other words, there's a recognition that there's a kind of mutual obligation between the Jewish people and the Almighty, and that election has responsibilities. But even in the end, even after our failings, God still remains faithful. And that's where it seems to me we fall into Paul, and Paul's grappling with who the people of Israel is. And of course, famously in Romans 9 to 11, this sense of how God remains faithful with Israel, how God wouldn't break his promises with Israel, because frankly, if God broke his promises with Israel, then what's the point of God's relationship with Christians, right? So it's that irrevocable relationship, what you've called, Etienne, this grafting in, the branch is damaged but not fallen off. Likewise, I think we'd, from a Jewish point of view, acknowledge the failings of the Jewish people from the moment they received revelation at Sinai, with the creation of the golden calf, to the present day, still remaining in that relationship with the Almighty. What Paul called the mystery of Israel, what Paul described as the stumbling of Israel, allowing in Gentiles into that relationship. So fundamentally, from a Jewish point of view, there is no change in that relationship. There is no change in that relationship between the Jewish people and God. They remain elect. There is a mission. It is connected with land. Now, for Christianity, of course, there has been a fundamental change. And the question is, has that fundamental change resulted in a break? And I think your answer is no. But it has resulted in a radical transformation through the Christ event. So what? Where does that leave us in terms of the Jewish-Christian situation? It seems to me that there are three options. One is that there is a new people that has replaced the old people. That's been the traditional teaching of the church, called replacement theology, called supersessionism, where there is only one people. And I think we, as Christians and Jews, I think it's fair to say, for the most part, that's rejected. And every so often I have a very keen Christian student remind me of question it, then I remind them, actually, don't forget Islam also sees itself as perfecting. So you want to know what it feels like to be replaced, just there are certain questions you need to ask about the relationship with Islamic theology. The second option is that there is one people, and I think that's what you're proposing, Etienne, that there is one people, identical in some respects, different in other respects. You use the term distinctive, and it's based on a unity. It's based on one covenant, sometimes called one covenant theology. And certainly I remember a conversation involving Cardinal Ratzinger, before he was Benedict XVI. There was discussion about one covenant and two covenant theory. And he was very adamant. He smiled very sweetly and put his hands together and said, yes, I've heard of two covenant theory. It is a sin. So that ended the conversation with my Catholic friends. But there's this one covenant theory that I think that's what you're proposing. I have a personal sympathy towards a two or multi-covenant theory, which is where your calling comes in, of many nations. I mean, God can make a covenant with whomsoever God wishes to make a covenant, right? We cannot restrict the Almighty from making a covenant. Just because I think he's made a covenant with the Jewish people does not prevent the Almighty from making a covenant with Christians and with other faithful communities. And that's where the nations can join Israel and be in that sacred space. And that, it seems to me, has the danger of falling into relativism, but allows for that, the creation of that space that enables us not to relate to each other in terms of contradistinction, over and against one another, but in mutual affirmation, and creating that theological space, I hope, in which you can be you, and frankly, I can be me. Thank you. Now, I think that leaves us a little bit of time for questions. I'm going to stand here for one moment, and this microphone is going to go around. Would you like to respond first, or would you want to hear some questions? Let's hear some questions. Yeah. And then we can. You have the last word, Etienne. Okay. Behind you, Doug, and then Doug.
Thank you very much, Etienne. I see the obvious attraction of keeping an understanding of Israel as distinct within the people of God in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, looking at your interpretation of Ephesians. But how does that fit with Paul's no longer Jew nor Greek in Galatians? Or do you not see Jew as being the same as Israel in what Paul says there?
Do you take Doug as well, and then we'll answer questions, but in front of you.
Sorry.
Doug, do you want to ask your question and then we'll answer? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm intrigued by your third category, the people by birth, people by adoption, people by calling. And I think back 500 years before there was a law, before Moses, 2,000 years before there was the Jesus and 2,500 years before Muhammad. It says in Genesis 18, God chose Abraham because he was righteous and just. So maybe the calling underlies the whole thing. Maybe, or to pick up on Ed's thing, there are multiple peoples, but in each case, what underlies them is we've been called in different ways. And rather than adding it on at the end, I suggest we put it at the beginning and say, in what sense are the people of God, the covenants, whatever you want to call them, the called people?
Should I use this? Yeah. Actually, there are a lot of interesting questions because they're also the questions of my two colleagues here. Maybe I should start with the questions that were just asked and then move towards these. For Galatians 3, I would say that the question behind this is, what is Paul trying to do? I mean, you can't pick the verse out of the context, and the context is the question of salvation. What's the criteria for salvation? And Paul is saying the difference between Jews and Gentiles. I really understand Jews here as members of the people of Israel. It's not something, but the difference between Jews and Gentiles, the difference between being a man and a woman, and between being slave or free, has no impact on salvation. Salvation is through Jesus Christ, and so on, and so on, and so on. And that is, of course, this is another thing we can discuss, but slave and free is certainly a category that has to disappear. Men and women, or male or female, I'm not sure. And so I'm not sure that Jew and Gentile is supposed to disappear as a category. But it's another question. This is not a question of salvation. It's a question of becoming member of a people. That's clear. For the other question, I don't know. I totally agree with the fact that and this is I totally agree. No, I agree that calling is the central, most important thing, but then that means that we have to rethink also the whole order of creation and nature. This is also Philip's question about nature and grace, is the fact that nature itself is a calling. That creation is a calling, especially in the case of a human being, because we are called into existence by God to answer God. So yes, fundamentally speaking, everything is a calling. But inside this calling, I would still make these differences between the nucleus on which the others are called to be grafted and the others. And there, I don't know to what extent the question of one or two covenants or multiple covenants was really present. You said it was in your question. I don't know how important it is.
Well, I was intrigued
Yeah.
by the idea, but it started with your third category.
Right.
But then I was wondering, can that third category really be
Yeah.
the foundation for all of the callings and
Yeah.
all of the peoples?
Which means that it's true that in God's eyes, by birth or by calling, at the end is not that fundamentally distinct. But I still believe we have to keep the difference. But it's more of a functional difference than an ontological difference. Once again, I don't know if for the people who are gathered here, this little group, the analogy with baptismal priesthood and ministerial priesthood was interesting or not, because it really depends to what extent you're familiar with Catholic theology and these new categories and so on. But I would say it's a functional difference that we have here. But in the end, everything comes through calling. On the other hand, I would have more difficulty in really following Ed completely on the multiple covenant or dual covenant. I understand how important it can be, because it's an easy way, it's a simple way rather, to keep the difference between Israel and the nations. To say, well, you have different covenants and everything is taken care of. But I have a feeling that it would be in contradiction with two very fundamental themes, not assertions, so it's more difficult to pinpoint, but themes in the Bible, which is one, the fact that the people of God and its relation, or their relation to God, is the image of faithfulness to one, in a man-woman relation, or in a relation of love. And so that would mean that there's only one. But of course, this is only an analogy, but it's so structural to the whole relation of God and Israel that it's a man and wife, that it would be weird to imagine that God becomes polygamous at some point. I'm sorry, but and the other thing is, because of what I was saying at the end, which I'm not 100% sure of, but that one of the reasons for the creation of this people is to unify all peoples into it, I would feel if we have to stop at some point and say, no, but we have multiple covenants or multiple peoples, it would seem to me as not going all the way to the end of this logic. But it's only one logic. This is just, maybe I can say two things that are reactions to other questions. The universalist I mentioned, you had too many questions, I'm not going to react to all of them, but the universalist, so Philip, I don't know if you remember, said, yes, that I was a bit too piano on the universalist dimension. It could include all of creation, well, all of mankind, non-Jew, non-Christians, of course, all of creation, non-humans, and so on. I agree. And I think that when one of the aspects of peoplehood and its relation to the land, and I'd like to get to the land bit, to the land is the fact that salvation does not only concern human beings, it really concerns the whole of creation. And that's very clear in the book of Revelations, but it's also clear in Isaiah that the whole of creation will be transfigured and will be related to this people. So yes, the only thing is, I think it's very important when we think about universality, that there are at least two ways of conceiving universality. One way is purely universal, and one way is a specific relation between a singular entity which keeps its singularity and its opening up to universality. And I think that God's logic is more the second dimension, which is, yes, universality, but the people of Israel keeps always, until the end, its distinctiveness to be able to offer universality to all the others.
That's also shaped by your Christological commitments, right?
Yeah.
How
I'm
could
able
not
to
be
say
better?
it without touching on the Christology, but it's true that thanks. As far as the land is concerned, yes, I had a few, in the paper there were a few things on it, but I didn't have time to say, but it's true that I think it's absolutely fundamental that land is part of the promise. I agree with the fact that many Christians do not address this question, and that the Roman Catholic Church is not addressing this question fully enough. Yes, definitely, it's impossible to say that the land is not part of the promise. That's for sure. But in the same way as peoplehood has to be converted or purified, there is something in this relation to the land that is absolutely unique, that asks for a conversion from the part of this people, or that's apophatic. And for example, there are 2-3 things that are quite impressive. Is God promises the land, and it's really this land. It's not Uganda or Madagascar or it's really Zion. But the 3 promises, the 3 main promises, all have different borders. So it means God promises this land, but the question of the borders is not God's direct question. The second thing is the people of Israel are created outside of the land. Interesting. They're created out of the land, and they've lived a great part of their history out of the land, which means that there is a special relation. And the third thing is there have always been strangers or foreigners, I don't know what the right word would be, in this land, yeah? Even theologically speaking, I mean, it's part of the law that there are these foreigners, that they really are to be welcomed and so on. So the question is, yes, this land really belongs to Israel, but if Israel is God's people and this land is given by God, then does that not mean that it should be shared in a certain way? No, I'm not saying you don't agree. I'm just trying to work on this idea. If it is a land given by God to a people of God who has ethical commitments that are God's commitments, then sharing a land with others may be the most converted way of receiving a land.
Yeah. And I think I'll just add one more thing, then we go around again, which is that whilst the land has the ability to vomit out the people if the people don't behave, as we know from biblical times, and there are, the parallels are obvious, at the same time that doesn't affect the relationship between the Jewish people and election, mission, promise.
And the land.
And the land and the danger of that land. Good, thank you. Right, shall we? Yes. After 1 and 2, we'll come back. Yeah.
I was struck in thinking, just back to the very basics of the title, who are the people of Israel, that it's
a very interesting way of saying it. I can comment that afterwards.
Sorry, that even looking at the word Israel itself in biblical text refers to a specific individual, right? It is personal all the way to the individual, both with regards to Jacob and then thinking about in the New Testament, Peter, Simon Peter as someone who also is named very actively, and that being kind of significant theologically and ecclesiologically, and I think in respective ways, both for the Old Testament and New. And within both circumstances, I think there is this notion of tension or struggle, or almost this sense of foreignness that you get all the way back to Abraham, of I will send you out into a foreign country that I will show you, to Jacob wrestling with an angel and limping away, right? But in a transformed way, all the way up to Peter, kind of proclaiming this or revealing something that only God could have revealed to him, but then entering into failure, forgiveness, etc. So maybe if you could, I don't know, I was just kind of curious your thoughts on how Israel and personhood as a kind of, as a name that you're given, or being called Israel or being called Peter, can kind of shape this conversation.
Thank you. Did you have a question, Mark, or not? I thought you... Did you raise your hand? No.
My only question is, do we really need a microphone?
It's to be recorded. Oh, posterity.
A question for the two gentlemen here. In view of your interpretation of commonality, as it were, how will you reinterpret for us Romans 11:26 when it says, "And so all Israel will be saved"?
Good question. That's a very interesting question about the single. I think the person, the name is a very interesting question.
I'm not sure I will be able to really not answer correctly, but to really find something, because your question is intuitively, I understand it's a very good question, and there's a treasure behind it. And if you want to add something, I would just say, I will say two things. Is just the first thing is, at the beginning you said, so this is not your question, but you said, who are the people of Israel? And the title was, who are the people of God? And it's, for me, but this was really something I'm still struggling with intellectually, because I have a feeling that at this point, I can say all are, in different ways, members of the people of God, but only Israel is Israel. I don't know if I'm clear about that. the Gentiles do not become members of Israel. They become members of the people of God, which is a wider reality, which is Israel opening up to a wider reality. But of course, the question is, where do we put the markers? Because we could also say, well, they are not either members of the people of God. They are members of a sort of community, family of God, the saints. So there we have markers that we have to choose. Don't choose arbitrarily, but we have to choose. But for the calling, all I can say is, so this is not the personal dimension, it's more the calling dimension. Yes, I find it absolutely essential to understand that Israel is created through a calling, and it's not a people that pre-exists naturally, but it's a people that becomes people through its calling, and then so it receives its vocation and its peoplehood at the same time. But I don't know. Maybe you want to, and then we can go to the other question afterwards. But
I think that it brings us back to the fact that the conversation always is between individuals, the individual person. It seems to me, and I think obviously the etymology of Israel and the person who wrestles with God and struggles and is a very good metaphor. It can be applied to the Jewish-Christian encounter. It can be applied to the Jewish-Jewish encounter. But what struck me that was helpful in terms of the people of God is that relationship starts from the individual. So when Moses encounters God, it's the individual person who encounters God at the burning bush and asks, "What am I encountering?" Is told that you're encountering who you're encountering, or who you were encountering, or who you will be encountering. I mean, it's that individual relationship. I think that might be quite helpful in teasing out some of these aspects of the particularities and the tension between the particularities and the universalities, what Philip was touching on. And I think that's quite helpful in exploring this issue of the people of God and the identity that you touched on in your paper more than in your presentation. But bringing it back to the individual, because it always begins with the individual. And from the individual, it can develop into the communal, and then possibly into the nations and all those other aspects. But I think it begins with the individual. And I think, biblically speaking, that's the biblical theology for both Old or Tanakh and New Testament.
Because I think that, for me at least, reinforces how, speaking even in language of possession, it isn't a kind of conversation about like theo-civil rights of demanding kind of my place, but of recognizing that God's grace already kind of structures the whole conversation, or kind of anticipates it in very particular historical ways.
And Romans 11:26.
Final solution to everything. What's clear, I think, is that all Israel in this case is the whole, the two branches, the branch that recognized Jesus as Messiah and the branch that did not recognize Jesus as Messiah. And being saved, I understand as being unified, finding its link together again, which means basically that very fundamentally speaking, there really is only one people at the end. There's only one people at the end, eschatologically speaking. The only thing is, how does this happen? And this is where I would follow Philip's advice on being more apophatic, but not only as a way out of the question. This is I think it's, never does Paul say they will recognize Jesus, for example. He doesn't say this. He says all Israel will be saved. He says there will be a unity. As a Christian, the implication is unity, but not how. The implication is that what is broken will not be broken anymore, that the tree will be whole. But it doesn't say how the tree will be whole again. Am I clear when I say this?
Yeah, but it's a bit contradictory what you're saying, in that going into all the world and preach the gospel. And then they're using the verse in Zechariah.
Yeah.
And they will look on him whom they have pierced. So they've taken this out of context. So consequently, all Israel will be saved.
It's like
I don't see where. wait, maybe I can just go all the way to the end of what I wanted to say is simply that as a Christian, I don't know if this is the question, but as a Christian, I would say it's difficult for me to see how this could happen without everybody recognizing Jesus as the Messiah. But I have no idea how this will happen, in the sense that in ecumenical discussions between Christian churches, we've seen to an incredible extent that we've been able to agree on things without using the same vocabulary and opening in different ways of understanding the same thing. And I have a feeling that we're going to continue working in this direction. We don't know what the end point is. When you start an ecumenical discussion, you know where you are, but you don't know where you're going to end up. And what happens at the end is that both are happy of the solution because it's a fuller solution, but no one expresses it the way the other wanted it at the beginning. And I think this is what's going to happen, and I don't have any idea how concretely it's going to be. I don't know if am I answering your question?
Yes,
Yeah.
I suppose I'd add a couple of points, which is one, even after Paul says that, he throws up his hands in a very Jewish way by saying, how inscrutable are your ways, O Lord?
Right.
In other words, I don't know how it's going to happen. On the one hand, God remains faithful with the Jewish people, with Israel. On the other hand, everything's changed in the Christ event. And he can't put the two together. He can't hold it. He can't connect it. He just accepts they're both facts. And that's why he ends up saying, how inscrutable are your ways? It's kind of leaving. It's a bit like, do we drink 5 cups of wine at Passover, or 4 cups with the 5 promises? We leave one for Elijah. And the second point that I always find quite helpful when I engage in Jewish-Christian dialogue as a Jew is that let's leave it to God. I mean, let's leave it to the end time. Because we can't force God's hand. We know that when we try to force God's hand, that actually it normally leads to some kind of disaster. That the eschaton is the eschaton. It's not just the end of the lecture, it's the end of time. And at that time of God's choosing, it will be resolved. And to have the faith that it will be resolved.
So maybe that should be the new gospel to preach, really.
Well, it is. Well, it is. I mean,
It is.
I'll
It
just
is.
add to what both Etienne and Ed have said is that from the point of view of contemporary Christian theology, there's a great deal of plurality about how salvation happens within a Christian framework. We don't know. There are lots of different models. We've moved over the centuries from models which focus on the cross, but most theologians have moved to a much broader canvas now to include, the resurrection, and distinguishing between models which focus on solving the sin problem, so-called infralepsarian models of sociology, to supralepsarian, which are more cosmic, involving the whole of creation. And so, again, we don't know. And I think. Well, on that apophatic note,
Eschatological and
apophatic. Let's thank again Etienne for coming today all the way from Rome to speak with us, to Ed for having organised all this, and I hope very much from the perspective of the von Hügel Institute at least, that the three of us and our institutes can do lots more together in the future. Thank you, Etienne.